In the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the world slept in peaceful ignorance, Arthur sat alone in the dim glow of his home audio studio. He was a professional sound engineer, a man who built his entire life around the delicate science of frequencies, decibels, and sound waves. To most people, silence was simply the absence of noise. But to Arthur, silence was a complex canvas waiting to be filled. His desk was littered with high-end digital audio workstations, studio monitors, and towering racks of specialized equipment. Tonight, however, Arthur was not working on a commercial film score or mastering an album for a local band. He was hunting for a glitch. It had started 3 nights ago, while he was reviewing ambient audio captures, recorded across the city for a background library. Deep within a seemingly ordinary midnight recording, buried under the low hum of streetlights and distant traffic, Arthur detected an unusual anomaly. It was an extremely low frequency, signal sitting right at 18.9 Hz. In the world of acoustics, frequencies below 20 Hz are known as infrasound. They fall just below the threshold of human hearing, yet the human body feels them as subtle vibrations, often triggering unexplained feelings of anxiety, dread, and sorrow. But this particular frequency was different. It was not a random natural vibration or industrial mechanical hum. It possessed a meticulous, intentional rhythm. Curious and completely unaware of the door he was about to unlock, Arthur put on his studio-grade reference headphones, dialed the gain, and isolated the signal. He began running the raw audio through a series of advanced digital filters to clean up the background noise and amplify the central wave. As the isolated frequency washed over him, he did not hear a sound through his ears. Instead, a strange metallic coldness settled in the back of his throat, and a sharp, sudden shiver traveled down his spine. The signal had an uncanny pattern, repeating in precise intervals that mirrored a slow, deliberate heartbeat. Driven by a mix of professional curiosity and growing obsession, Arthur decided to enhance the signal further. He mapped the frequency onto a visual equalizer, watching the bright green digital waveforms dance across his dual monitors. The audio visualizer displayed unnatural, jagged peaks that refused to follow standard acoustic laws. Every time the frequency hit a specific crescendo, Arthur felt a strange, subtle twitch in his right hand. He looked down at his fingers resting on the mixing console. His index finger jerked slightly to the left, completely against his conscious will. He frowned, assuming it was merely muscle fatigue from working excessive hours in the dark. He continued adjusting the audio controls, increasing the resonance of the 18.9 Hz signal to see how far the waveform would stretch. The moment the dial turned past the halfway mark, a sharp, crisp, snapping noise echoed directly inside his head. It was not a sound playing through his headphones. It was a physical sensation, originating from within his own skull. It sounded exactly like a dry twig snapping under heavy pressure, instantly followed by the deep, grinding friction of bone rubbing against bone. Arthur winced, pulling the headphones off his ears and throwing them onto the wooden desk. He sat panting in the pitch-black room, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He brought his hands up to rub his aching temples, but as his fingers moved across his face, he froze in absolute horror. Every subtle movement of his facial muscles produced a distinct audible crunch. When he blinked, his eye sockets emitted a soft, wet creaking sound. When he swallowed, his jaw alignment made a hollow, wooden clicking noise that resonated internally through his skull. Arthur scrambled out of his chair, backing away from the desk in pure panic. He held his breathing steady, trying desperately to stay motionless. If he did not move, there was no sound. But the moment he took a step backward toward the studio door, his knee joint emitted a sickeningly loud crack that echoed loudly off the acoustic foam panels on the walls. It was not the familiar, harmless pop of a joint being cracked. It was the heavy, agonizing sound of skeletal structures grinding together like grinding stones. Horrified, Arthur looked down at his arm. Beneath his pale skin, the long bones of his forearm were shifting. He watched in sheer disbelief as the skin stretched tightly over his ulna, pushing outward, as if something underneath was remolding his internal. Anatomy from the inside out. The frequency had not merely played through his headphones, it had rewritten the neural mapping between his brain and his physical body. The acoustic wave had introduced a parasitic rhythm to his nervous system, forcing his bones, joints, and tendons to resonate in harmony with the audio track. His body was no longer his own. It was being forcibly converted into a physical musical instrument. Desperate to stop the nightmare, Arthur lunged back toward the mixing desk to cut the power supply to his equipment. But as he reached out his right arm, his elbow joint locked at an unnatural, inverted angle with a deafening bone-snapping sound. Pain shot through his entire nervous system, white-hot and agonizing. He screamed in agony, but the vocal cords inside his throat did not produce a normal human cry. Instead, his larynx vibrated violently, emitting a hollow musical chime that echoed the exact melody of the 18.9 Hertz frequency playing on his monitors. Every movement he made to fight the pain only accelerated the physical transformation. He took another ragged breath, and his ribcage compressed violently inward, the sternum cracking loudly into 3 distinct sections that clicked against each other in rhythmic unison. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor, squirming in agony, but every squirm, twitch, and spasm generated a complex, horrifying arrangement of snapping bones and stretching sinew. His body was performing a symphony of destruction, playing a song composed by an invisible, sinister force embedded within the audio track. On the desk above him, the computer screens flared brightly. The digital waveform on the visualizer was no longer responding to the audio file. It was now recording in real time, capturing every snap, crunch, and vibration coming from Arthur's contorted body on the floor. The software was automatically mixing his physical agony into the master track, layering the sound of his breaking skeletal structure directly onto the infrasound loop. With his left hand, the only limb that had not yet completely inverted, Arthur dragged his heavy, mangled body inch by inch toward the wall outlet. The pain was blinding, every millimeter of progress requiring a sacrifice of clicking vertebrae and tearing muscle tissue. Tears of blood mixed with sweat streamed down his pale cheeks as he pushed through the unbearable agony. He finally reached the thick black power cables supplying electricity to his entire studio setup. Wrapping his trembling fingers around the rubber plug, he pulled with every ounce of strength he had left. The power cord snapped out of the wall with a spark of blue electricity. Instantly, the computer monitors went dark. The studio monitors went dead, and absolute silence swallowed the room. Arthur lay flat on his back in the suffocating darkness, chest heaving, listening intently. The agonizing vibrations inside his nerves began to recede, cooling down like hot metal quenched in cold water. The unnatural rhythmic spasms in his muscles slowly ceased. He let out a long, ragged sigh of relief, realizing the physical nightmare had stopped the moment the audio signal was cut off. His body was broken, battered, and bleeding internally, but the forced transformation had halted. He was still alive, and he was once again in control of his own breathing. He lay there on the cold carpet for what felt like hours, waiting for his body to stabilize, enough so he could crawl out of the room to call for emergency medical help. The silence of the night felt safe, peaceful, and merciful. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of quiet recovery. Then deep inside his chest, right near his heart, a tiny, crisp snapping sound echoed. Arthur's eyes flew open in absolute paralyzing terror. He had not moved a single muscle. His limbs were completely still, yet a second hollow click echoed from his collarbone, followed immediately by the rhythmic, vibrating tension of a tendon tightening in his neck. He realized the terrifying truth far too late. The frequency no longer needed the computer, the speakers, or the headphones to play. The audio signal had been fully recorded into the calcium of his bones and the fibers of his muscles. His living body had become the storage medium, the master tape, and the playback system all at once. His own heartbeat was now acting as the metronome, driving the 18.9 Hertz rhythm forward, slowly strumming the bone and sinew of his failing body into the dark, unending melody of the night. The sprawling, commercial complex at the edge of the city had stood vacant for nearly 15 years, a massive concrete relic of late 20th century corporate ambitions that had collapsed under the weight of financial scandal and sudden abandonment. Julian, a senior restoration architect specializing in historical and commercial structures, was hired by a private development group to survey the long-forgotten building before demolition or full-scale reconstruction could begin. Equipped with a heavy flashlight, a digital laser measuring tool, and a faded blueprint binder recovered from the municipal archives, Julian spent his days pacing the hollow, echoing corridors of the third floor, where dust settled like gray snow over cheap, beige carpeting and rusted metal door frames. It was during his fourth evening on site, while cross-referencing the physical measurements of the inner structural pillars against the original 1978 architectural floor plans, that Julian noticed an unsettling mathematical anomaly. When he added together the square footage of every mapped office suite, storage closet, utility shaft, and hallway on the third floor, the total sum fell exactly 16 square meters short of the building's exterior perimeter footprint. In modern construction, minor discrepancies were common due to thick concrete columns or hollow utility chases, but a 16 square meter void, a perfect 4x4 meter square, sitting directly in the geometric center of the floor plan, was impossible to ignore. He flipped through the original blueprint pages, searching for a forgotten ventilation shaft or a hidden elevator mechanics room, but the center of the third floor layout was simply drawn as a solid, unbroken block of poured concrete, surrounded on all four sides by ordinary office suites. There were no access doors, no air ducts, no electrical conduits, and no blue ink annotations, explaining why a massive hollow box had been sealed. Inside the heart of the structure, intrigued by the prospect of a forgotten storage vault or an unmapped structural secret, Julian brought a heavy sledgehammer and an industrial inspection camera to the building late the following night, determined to unravel the mystery before the construction crews arrived. Standing in the narrow, windowless hallway between Suite 304 and Suite 305, Julian tapped his hammer along the plasterboard wall, listening closely to the change in pitch. Where the wall should have sounded hollow, the impact produced a dull, dense thud, indicating solid concrete poured directly behind the drywall. He adjusted his safety goggles, took a deep breath, and swung the heavy sledgehammer into the surface. The dry plaster cracked and crumbled, revealing a thick, dark gray layer of industrial cinder blocks underneath. Unlike the rest of the building, which was framed with light drywall and steel studs, this central block had been encased in reinforced concrete and mortar, as if designed to contain immense pressure or prevent anything from entering. Driven by a mix of professional curiosity and growing unease, Julian struck the cinder block wall repeatedly, the deafening echoing cracks shattering the heavy silence of the vacant building. After 20 minutes of exhausting labor, a chunk of concrete yielded. Collapsing inward into the darkness behind the wall, Julian paused, panting heavily in the cold air, wiping sweat from his forehead as he raised his flashlight to the jagged opening. He expected to see dust-covered floorboards, old filing cabinets, or bare steel beams. Instead, the beam of his flashlight hit a surface that defied every fundamental law of civil engineering and organic biology. Beyond the broken concrete wall lay a narrow, claustrophobic corridor that did not belong in a commercial office building. The walls, ceiling, and floor were not made of wood, brick, or metal. They were constructed from a thick, slick, pale pink membrane that resembled living human tissue. The surface was crisscrossed with a dense network of dark red veins, pulsing with a slow rhythmic cadence that pushed a faint, sickly warmth into the cold air of the hallway. As Julian stared into the opening, His jaw slackened in horror as he realized the entire organic corridor was gently contracting and expanding in a slow, continuous cycle that perfectly mimicked the rhythm of deep, unconscious breathing. A heavy, humid odor rushed out from the breach, smelling of iron, copper, and damp soil, thick enough to coat the back of his throat. Julian fell back against the opposite drywall, his heart hammering violently against his ribcage as his mind struggled to process the impossibility in front of him. The building had not merely been constructed around an empty space. The structure had grown around a living, biological organ that had remained dormant inside the concrete for nearly half a century. Instead of fleeing the building immediately, a bizarre, suffocating trance gripped Julian's consciousness, drawing him closer to the rupture. He pulled his small digital inspection camera from his belt, extended the flexible fiber-optic lens, and pushed it through the jagged hole in the concrete. The camera's bright LED light illuminated the interior of the organic chamber, revealing that the fleshy tunnel extended far beyond the 16 square meters indicated on the blueprint. The fleshy walls stretched downward at a steep angle, descending far deeper than the physical limits of the building's foundation should have allowed, sinking into an endless dark abyss that breathed with terrifying regularity. As Julian watched the live feed on his handheld monitor, the camera lens brushed against one of the thick, pulsing veins along the wall. Instantly, a low, wet vibration shuddered through the floorboards beneath his boots, making the dust on the carpet dance. On the monitor screen, the walls of the organic tunnel suddenly constricted tight, reacting to the touch like a sensitive nerve ending. Deep within the pit, far below the foundation of the third floor, a low, wet, gurgling sound began to rise, resembling the sound of thick liquid being forced through a narrow pipe under immense hydraulic pressure. Panicked, Julian yanked the inspection camera back, but the flexible cable caught on a jagged edge of the broken cinder block. He pulled harder, but the cable snapped, leaving the camera head lodged inside the living wall. The moment the camera broke, the slow breathing rhythm of the room suddenly stopped. The humid air in the hallway turned ice cold, and an absolute, suffocating silence descended upon the vacant floor. Julian stood frozen in the beam of his flashlight, holding his breath, terrified that the slightest sound would draw the attention of whatever resided within the concrete matrix. Then from inside the dark opening, a soft, wet, slithering noise began to move toward the hole. Something massive was dragging itself up the steep slope of the organic tunnel, pressing against the pale pink walls with heavy, rhythmic thuds that shook the concrete floor beneath Julian's feet. The pulsing veins around the edges of the broken wall began to bleed a thick, dark fluid that dripped onto the dusty carpet with a rhythmic, sickening splash. Julian dropped his flashlight, turned, and sprinted down the pitch-black hallway toward the central stairwell, his heavy boots booming through the empty building. Behind him, the sound of tearing concrete and shattering masonry echoed through the corridor as the 4x4 meter chamber expanded outward, breaking free from its concrete casing. The air became thick with the iron stench of blood and wet earth, rushing down the hallway like a draft from an open window. He reached the heavy steel door of the stairwell, slammed his weight against the push bar, and burst into the concrete emergency stairs, throwing his body down the flights 3 steps at a time. Above him, the sound of structural timber snapping and steel girders bending under immense biological pressure echoed down the stairwell shaft, accompanied by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated directly inside his teeth and jawbones. The building was not falling apart due to age or neglect. It was being consumed and reshaped from the inside by an architecture that was fully, terrifyingly alive. Julian stumbled out of the emergency exit doors into the cold night air, tumbling onto the asphalt of the deserted parking lot. He scrambled to his feet, breathing frantically, and turned to look up at the 3rd floor of the silent structure. From the outside, the building looked completely normal under the pale yellow glow of the streetlights. The dark glass windows of the 3rd floor reflected the night sky, unbroken and calm, showing no outward signs of the nightmare unfolding within its central core. However, As Julian watched in paralyzed terror, he noticed the faint, amber safety lights lining the exterior walls of the third floor begin to flicker in a slow, rhythmic pattern. They brightened and dimmed in unison, setting a steady, deliberate pace that mirrored the exact cycle of deep, organic breathing he had witnessed inside the wall. The entire middle section of the concrete building seemed to expand outward by a fraction of an inch before settling back down. Pulsing against the night sky like a sleeping chest cavity, he backed away toward his car, fumbling with his keys, realizing with sickening clarity why the original architects had sealed the 4x4-meter space in poured concrete without doors, windows, or records. They had not built the room to keep people out. They had encased the structure to keep the growing organ contained, praying that dark concrete and silence would keep it dormant forever. But the seal was now broken, the wall was breached, and the unclaimed room in the floor plan was finally waking up, extending its living roots into every pillar, beam and wall of the city around it. The auction for the old colonial estate on the outskirts of town had ended, quicker than expected, leaving Arthur and his young family as the proud new owners of a property that had sat abandoned for nearly 30 years. The house was a sprawling, two-story structure built from dark timber and weathered stone, surrounded by towering oak trees that blocked out the warm afternoon sun. Inside, the air was cold, smelling faintly of dried lavender, old paper and damp wood. For Arthur, an ambitious digital creator who spent his life immersed in audio, engineering and storytelling, the house felt like a quiet sanctuary, away from the chaotic noise of the city. His wife, Clara, loved the high ceilings and antique woodwork, while their 7-year-old daughter, Lily, immediately claimed the spacious bedroom on the second floor. During their first week in the home, the atmosphere felt remarkably peaceful, but a subtle acoustic quirk soon began to manifest in the quietest hours of the night. It started as a faint, localized echo that only occurred in the master bedroom and the adjoining hallway. If someone spoke in a quiet whisper near the heavy, mahogany wardrobe sitting in the corner of the bedroom, the sound would not dissipate into the air like normal sound waves. Instead, the room seemed to absorb the acoustic energy, storing it in the dense, dry air of the corners. Hours later, when the house fell completely silent at midnight, the stored sounds would release themselves, repeating the exact words in a soft, dry hiss that bounced off the wooden floorboards. Arthur discovered this phenomenon quite by accident on a Tuesday evening. While packing away his equipment in the bedroom, he had quietly grumbled under his breath about a misplaced set of keys. At 3 o'clock in the morning, as he lay awake listening to the wind outside, he heard his own voice whisper the exact same sentence from the dark corner near the wardrobe. It was so crisp, so perfectly articulated, that he instinctively sat up, thinking someone was standing beside his bed. When he turned on the lamp, the room was empty. Being a man driven by logic and sound physics, Arthur assumed the ancient architecture created a rare acoustic resonant chamber, a natural phenomenon where sound waves ricocheted between the floorboards and plaster walls before finally escaping into the open room. He found the glitch fascinating and even considered recording it for his next project. However, the nature of the echoes quickly began to take a far more sinister turn. The house did not just echo spoken words, it possessed a terrifying ability to capture unspoken thoughts, the fleeting, dark, and desperate ideas that people silently vocalized in their heads through subtle, unconscious micro-movements of their lips and vocal cords. Human beings constantly engage in internal monologue, quietly forming words in their throats without ever blowing air through their lips. The house was somehow catching these micro-vibrations, amplifying them, and broadcasting them into the dark when everyone was supposed to be sleeping. It began innocently enough with minor secrets. One night, as Arthur lay in the dark, he heard Clara's voice whisper softly from the corner of the room, stating that she hated the color of the kitchen walls and regretted letting Arthur choose the furniture Arthur smiled in the darkness, assuming she had simply murmured in her sleep earlier that day. But the following night, the whispers became darker and far more personal. From the shadows near the ceiling, a bitter, hushed version of Arthur's own voice echoed through the room, repeating a terrifying thought he had kept buried deep in his mind during a stressful moment at work, a silent, passing thought where he wished he could just pack his bags and vanish, abandoning his family to escape his suffocating financial pressures. Arthur froze in bed, his heart hammering violently against his ribs as he turned to look at Clara. She was fast asleep beside him, completely unaware that his most shameful, secret thought had just been broadcast aloud into the quiet bedroom. A wave of ice-cold paranoia washed over him. The house was stripping away the protective walls of their minds, exposing the fleeting, intrusive thoughts that every human experiences but never dares to say out loud. He realized with absolute horror that if Clara heard the things his mind created during moments of anger or exhaustion, it would destroy their marriage completely. As the days passed, the atmosphere inside the house grew thick with mutual distrust and suffocating paranoia. Arthur stopped speaking entirely whenever he was inside the estate, keeping his mouth pressed into a tight, rigid line, terrified that any subtle motion of his jaw would give the walls more ammunition. Clara, too, had grown strangely distant and quiet, avoiding eye contact and spending long hours sitting silently in the garden. They moved through the grand hallways like two ghost-like figures, living in a forced, unnatural silence, desperately trying to keep their minds blank. But the human mind cannot be silenced by willpower alone. The harder one tries not to think about something, the louder that thought becomes inside the brain. The true nightmare peaked on a stormy Thursday evening when a severe lightning storm knocked out the local power grid, plunging the house into complete pitch-black darkness. The heavy rain battered the roof, creating a continuous, drumming noise that masked the quiet sounds of the interior. Unable to sleep, Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the dark outline of the antique mahogany wardrobe in the corner. The air in the bedroom felt thick, heavy and charged with an intense, suffocating pressure, like the atmosphere right before a massive explosion. Without warning, the natural sound of the rain outside seemed to mute itself, pulled down into an unnatural hush. From the dark interior of the wardrobe, a soft, wet clicking noise echoed, followed by the sound of a long, raspy breath. Arthur's entire body went rigid with terror. It was not a simple echo this time. The house had accumulated weeks of dark thoughts, secret resentments and hidden fears, compressing them into a dense, sentient acoustic entity that was now ready to play everything back at once. A voice emerged from the shadows of the wardrobe, a voice that sounded like a horrifying, distorted mashup of Clara and Arthur, layered over each other in a discordant, disharmonious duet. The voice began to whisper the terrible, fleeting thoughts Clara had held during their worst arguments, detailing her deepest insecurities, her fears about Arthur's instability, and her silent doubts about their future together. Beside him, Clara stirred and sat up, her eyes wide with horror as she heard her own internal voice, echoing from the darkness, revealing things she had never intended to share with anyone in the world. Clara covered her ears with both hands, tears streaming down her pale face as she sobbed, begging the darkness to stop. But the acoustic entity inside the wardrobe was only getting started. The voice shifted smoothly, adopting Arthur's tone, and began broadcasting the dark, intrusive thoughts he had experienced while looking at his daughter during a moment of severe depression, irrational, terrifying thoughts about how much simpler life would be if he had never started a family at all. The words spilled out of the darkness with a cruel, cold precision, destroying the trust between husband and wife with every syllable that vibrated through the room. Arthur jumped out of bed, screaming at the top of his lungs to drown out the horrifying whispers, but his loud scream only provided the room with fresh acoustic energy. The entity absorbed his scream instantly, throwing it back at him with a metallic, agonizing echo that rattled the window panes. Clara scrambled out of bed, looking at Arthur with a mixture of profound betrayal, absolute terror, and heartbreak. She backed away toward the bedroom door, shaking her head in disbelief as the house continued to play back every dark, silent thought he had ever harbored in his mind. Desperate to destroy the source of the nightmare, Arthur grabbed a heavy brass floor lamp from beside the nightstand and rushed toward the antique wardrobe. He swung the heavy metal base with all his strength, smashing the wooden doors of the wardrobe into splinters. The wood shattered with a deafening crack, but behind the broken panels, there was no back wall to the furniture. Instead, the wardrobe opened into a vast, swirling vortex of black, mist-like shadows that vibrated with thousands of overlapping, whispering human voices, the accumulated unspoken words of every unfortunate soul who had ever lived inside the house over the last century. The swirling mass of acoustic mist spilled out from the broken wardrobe, wrapping itself around Arthur's face and throat like a cold, damp cloth. The entity did not attack his physical body. Instead, it forced its way down his throat, pouring thousands of chaotic, conflicting thoughts directly into his mind. Arthur collapsed onto his knees on the wooden floor, clutching his head as his consciousness was flooded with the dark. Tragic secrets of strangers long dead, confessions of murder, betrayals, deep-seated hatred, and profound sorrow that had been trapped inside the walls for decades. He lay on the floor, thrashing in agony as the mental noise tore through his sanity, destroying his ability to form a coherent thought. Through the haze of horrifying audio, he heard the bedroom door slam shut as Clara fled the room with Lily, their frantic footsteps fading down the stairs until the front door clicked shut, leaving him entirely alone with the house. Hours passed, and the storm outside finally cleared, allowing the pale light of dawn to creep through the bedroom windows, illuminating the destruction in the room. Arthur lay motionless on the cold floorboards, his eyes wide, hollow, and staring blankly at the ceiling. The chaotic storm of voices in his head had finally settled into a flat, terrifying silence. His body was completely unharmed, but his mind had been stripped entirely bare, emptied of all personal identity, memories, and emotions. He slowly sat up, his movements stiff and mechanical, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He looked around the quiet, empty bedroom, feeling no fear, no grief, and no desire to escape. He opened his mouth to call out his wife's name, but no sound came out of his throat. His vocal cords were completely paralyzed, unable to produce even the faintest whisper. As he sat there in the pale morning light, a soft, dry clicking noise echoed from the dark corners of the ceiling above him. The house was still listening, patiently waiting for the subtle, unconscious vibrations of his next thought. But inside Arthur's mind, there were no words left to speak, no secrets left to hide, and no thoughts left to echo, only a vast cold and permanent silence that would keep the estate quiet for many years to come.